building for everyone. We're here talking with some real life developers about web accessibility. Super excited to be doing this today. And I will introduce everyone. My name is Amy Brown. I am the VP of our digital experience team here at New Era. And with me, I have Nikki and Matt. We're talking today about web accessibility from a developer's perspective. And I actually wrote down a few things I've heard throughout my career from developers about web accessibility. I've heard there's a perception that web accessibility can slow down development, just makes everything slower. Some people think it makes things ugly or that it sacrifices performance. Some people think that tools catch everything. I don't need to think about it. I'm going to have a tool that catches it all for me. And, if it's done right, there's often ways to make some of these pain points less painful. So with me, I have Nikki and Matt. Would you guys like to introduce yourself? Matt, you can start.
Sure, Amy. Yeah, so I'm a senior UX developer. I've been doing this for about 20 years now, and I'm currently on a contract with a client that I work on a enterprise level design system. So I'm a tech lead on that project, and so we do a lot of accessibility reviews and design work and implementation because it's very important that we do that for our clients and customers.
Awesome. Thanks for that. And Nikki, tell us a little bit about yourself, your career.
Cool. Yeah. I started kind of getting into dev stuff about 6 years ago, and now I'm a senior dev at New Era with you guys. Been with New Era for about 3 years, and then kind of my day to day now, I do work in with a lot of CMSs, like CMS solutions for clients, mostly in HubSpot, but also like with some headless CMS stuff, like Butter CMS is one. Which there's a lot of additional, I think, accessibility concerns with CMSs that we'll probably get into in a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. Thing. And I think it's great to have both of you on because I think both of those use cases working in kind of a design system as well as in a web CMS that you might be customizing for a single use case, they probably have a few different considerations to keep in mind. So I'm glad we'll be able to get your perspective. I'm curious, do you guys recall how you first got made aware of web accessibility? Like when did you start to hear about it? How did it come up? Nikki, do you want to start this time?
Sure, yeah. So mine was actually, I'm a self-taught developer, and there weren't a lot of mentions of web accessibility in like kind of a lot of the resources I was using at the time. So I hadn't really heard much about it, but I was working at a startup. This was shortly before New Era, so maybe like 3-ish years ago. And I started as a developer at the time. I think around the time I was head of product, and there was a client we wanted to get, like there was this big customer, but they required, they needed to do an audit on our software. It was a scheduling application, think like Calendly kind of deal, with like a back end and like a CRM solution kind of deal. But they had to do this audit, and they covered a lot of things like web security was a big one, and accessibility was another one. And, like I said, accessibility, I hadn't really heard much about it. I heard the term, but didn't really know anything. But then that audit caught a lot,
as they do.
It caught some stuff, and seeing the results of that audit and like the specific items that were mentioned, it kind of like opened my eyes to what web accessibility meant and what it covered, and like how wide the impact could be. I was very upset seeing all of the ways that that our application was lacking. I saw it at the time as like essentially the application being biased against people who use assistive technologies or have a disability. I was mad. craft. And I
You
didn't
felt
blame anyone
righteous
else.
anger on behalf of the user. I don't know if I was
I,
expecting that answer.
And it was very, it was just so new. And I kind of delved after that a little bit in my free time into seeing kind of how deep it went. And it was very daunting. um, so yeah, I mean, that's kind of when it first came into my head. And I tried to get people to buy in at the company, but it was, it was a startup. It was really fast paced. It was kind of hard to
Of
justify
course.
that, especially without people who were, experts in it and be able to kind of get rolling really fast. Um, but yeah, it stayed in me simmering.
Matt, did you have a similar experience? When did you first come across web accessibility?
Well, I would say it's probably at my current client. I'll just say it's a pharmaceutical company. It kind of reminds me, honestly, of the responsive revolution back in the early 20 teens when we started.
Interesting.
Well,
Interesting comparison.
when it's kind of another dimension, right? So the when we started going from fixed width layouts, which were all the rage, to responsive design, that was kind of a big deal. I mean, that was also to facilitate usability on multiple user devices and things like that. And so when we started looking at accessibility for the design system at this current client, we started, looking at keyboard interactions, voiceovers. They brought in some WCAG certified, consultants that were going over web apps and interfaces and telling us about, how to use ARIA labels and how the semantic HTML structure needed to be addressed so that when you're using a system like particularly screen readers like JAWS and NVDA and Apple VoiceOver, how those things read. And in fact, they had us, listen to some of that stuff. They brought in somebody that had that kind
Cool.
of setup, and it was just a consultant that set it all up and played it back for us. And it was just like, oh, wow. And it's just another dimension, honestly. Like I said earlier, you kind of just have to think about it a little bit when you're building your markup. But and I think you mentioned early on that that some people think it's ugly. Well, there are some things that were just intrinsic to the web that we've been kind of ignoring for a long time up to that
Interesting.
point, right? Like focus rings and stuff. There was a big push against that at first. People didn't want to see that stuff on websites, but now I think people are just used to it again. And it's just showing you where your tab focus is and things like that. Or links not being strange colors or not, being underlined, or contrast ratios and all those things that are, once you kind of get used to dealing with those, they're not really that bad. But yeah, it was, yeah, it just was with that first client there. Previous to the client I was at, we were building a lot more one-off websites, like Nikki talked about, doing CMS work. That's what I was doing mainly before coming over to New Era. And that's a lot harder sell. With a design system, we're baking in that for like hundreds of websites that have to use it. So we're constantly iterating on a single product. And so that also helps. It helps.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're on a tight timeline with a budget and all that to try and get like a website out the door, it may be a little bit more of, it's just one more layer, one more cost
Sure.
perhaps that's involved. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, it's very interesting how you guys came about it. One way being very much, I don't know, Nikki, you're self-taught and you just kind of stumbled into the feedback, whereas Matt, it sounds like there was almost I want to say systematic, but they took the time out to kind of educate you and demonstrate, what does this sound like through an e-reader. I will say my exposure to accessibility was first on the design side. I don't think I understood for a little bit the implications that it's not just that color contrast is approved. There's so much more to how it really impacts what you build, what you do. So anyway, I appreciate you guys sharing that. As you were learning, did you use any resources that were helpful to you? Was there anything you might guide people to if they're just now learning about web accessibility?
one of the things I looked at was the WAI site on
Yep.
W3C. They have,
Yep.
it's called the Web Accessibility Initiative on W3C, or W3.org is what it really is. And that has a ton of just, it's basically HTML. Like, this is how you scaffold up accessible web
Yep.
interfaces. You know, it's all HTML5. It's all fairly modern standards and everything, of course. And that's been very helpful. In fact, we link out to this in some of the design system documentation. For example, tables are extremely difficult depending on what you're doing. They can be extremely difficult, I guess I should say, depending on how you're wanting to present information to get them to be accessible and the way that you have to put a number of attributes and things on them. And they have tons of tutorials on all those things. So that's one easy reference. I mean, it's free. You don't have to pay for anything. It's just out there. So
It's great. Nikki, any others you wanted to call out?
I mean, the W3C, WAI websites were definitely one that I was wanting to bring up, just because it's so helpful. How like
Agree.
it's probably the thing I use most consistently. Like, I don't know, say you type into Google the developer best friend and say accessible accordion HTML or whatever, and then they have a page that's like, this is what it needs to look like. Like Matthew said, this is the HTML. This is the, there's all of this stuff, all of the like ARIA labels and ARIA roles, all of that stuff is just like, this is exactly what you need to do. Keyboard functionality, this is exactly how the keyboard functionality needs to work. So, I did what, yeah, it's great. And then also you mentioned like the automated testing tools, Amy. They are, I'm sure we'll talk about them more at some point, but they're really helpful. Like the Wave extension and the Axe dev tools are super duper helpful, both for finding stuff, but also they tell you, like, give you options or resources on how to address them. So if it's like, oh, this stuff doesn't, they don't have accessible names, so they can't be accessed by accessible technologies. Try using this code, try using this label, try adding this thing.
Yep.
That really helps you kind of get that in there. And then the last thing is the DQ CPAC certification course. Is probably the thing that changed the game for me most. Like, it is so in depth, and really good at kind of driving home both the technical aspects, because it's not just about web accessibility, the certification. So you learn kind of like the why around it. I think that's the most important thing, is once you stop seeing it as like a task or like an additional thing and just kind of a given, that makes the whole thing way easier. Like, that's the best resource I could say, is like that certification just changed the game. So
That's really interesting, because it leads directly into my next question, I think. Is there anything that was like an aha moment for you when as you're kind of learning about this and being like, how the heck do I bake this into what I do? I mean, would you point to that as maybe a big factor in how you approach the work now?
100%. Like, at first, like I said, when I learned kind of about it in the revelation moment, with that audit I mentioned, I could see that it went deep, right? Like, and then the more you kind of look into it, if you haven't looked into it much, you're like, well, ARIA roles and semantic HTML. If you haven't, I remember once I advocated. This was not at New Era, I promise. I advocated once for taking a table that was written semantically, and I was like, "This is ridiculous. It's so hard to work on. Let's just make it all divs." I have nightmares about that now, but. So it was
Your
rough.
nightmares are very different than my nightmares, but
but it's, so like seeing it as like this additional task, or like this deep well of that I just have to like over time just like delve into, and it makes things like more difficult to do. After taking the CPAC, or like the course, and get the process of getting the certification, that changed for me, and that I think is the most, having that, like you said, aha moment is probably the most beneficial or impactful thing I can think of just because it makes it all easier at that point. When you no longer think of it at the end, or like it's like a to do, you're building something and you're like, oh, this needs to be like, not even that, just as it's happening, completely changes everything. So
That's great.
Yeah,
Matt,
and Nikki,
anything? Go ahead. Go ahead.
oh yeah, sorry, no, no, Nikki's absolutely right. It's not something that's tacked on at the end. You need to be thinking about it as you're building out whatever it is you're building. Just like I mentioned earlier about responsive design. You think about how things are going to be for mobile and desktop and tablet. Well, you think about how a screen reader might need to use this, or how the semantic document. You kind of asked an aha moment. That was hearing some screen reader feedback, or at least having somebody explain to you how a screen reader ends up reading through a document is kind of like, oh, that makes sense. That's why these things are being designed this way from a spec level. And it also kind of an aha moment, I guess, a little bit, is that it's going back to the basics of HTML, like how an HTML document is supposed to be constructed if you strip all the CSS and some of the JavaScript off of it. If you were just going to build a web page, like you did 25 years ago, maybe, right? Where, your heading levels need to be semantically correct. You're supposed to use the correct semantic elements, like in the past, I'm sure you've both probably seen this. I'm sure a lot of people have seen this, where you just take, HTML elements and turn them into all kinds of different things. You can make a div do almost anything, right? Or with JavaScript, you can apply event handlers to things that aren't really, interactive elements, and things like that. And it's like, no, you need to be using a button. If you're creating an event, a click event handler, you need to be using an anchor tag if you're making a hyperlink. And then you can use CSS to make those things look however it is that you want them to look. But from a semantic accessibility standpoint, it needs to be the appropriate thing in the back end. And so it adds a little bit of a challenge sometimes to how you're constructing the markup for what you ultimately want it to look like visually. But in the end, if you're skilled with CSS and stuff, you can make almost anything look the way you want it to look and still be accessible in a semantic way. So yeah, I think that's and when you start wrapping that up all into your head, the responsive design, the accessible design, the user interface, best practices and stuff, it all just kind of comes together naturally. And you can run into some of that being trying to shoehorn it in if you're retrofitting some older system, but if you're building fresh, like we just rebuilt the design system at my pharmaceutical client, and all those things were baked in to begin with. Nothing was tacked on. It was all very deliberate. So
that's awesome.
That's the right way to do it, in my opinion. I mean, anything worth doing is worth doing right. So as me and another accessibility consultant at the client were, we both had that conversation. And I'll just kind of tack on here, since Nikki brought up DQ's Axe Dev tools. The client I'm at, they do use that, and they have I believe it's a GitHub action that they have automated on the PRs that they do for the web apps that they build, and they run like an automated accessibility check, and it catches a lot of stuff. It's a very good utility from what I've heard. I don't use it personally, because we do manual accessibility reviews for the design systems work. So we don't really, because we're building components that aren't holistically accessible, and DQ's tool is more for like a holistic assessment of a web app.
Sure.
So it makes more sense in a web app environment. But I have heard from the accessibility consultants that it still requires at least, a good, run through to make sure that you've caught everything, or that, the tool doesn't give you, doesn't miss things, or doesn't give you false positives on stuff. Because there are, like, especially with screen readers, they're apparently just as finicky as cross-browser issues are when you're dealing with visual design. Especially,
I'm not sure I knew that.
Yeah, so it depends. A lot of times what you see on the WAI site or various other utilities, they'll have it one way, and I think the most compliant one is JAWS, I think. Whereas Apple VoiceOver can be, a little bit more quirky, and NVDA don't know a whole lot about. It's a little bit more like the Wild West days of IE and things, when we had browsers that had standard compliance issues. There's compliance issues amongst how the screen readers handle various ARIA labels and stuff. So we've had to tweak, particularly on the design system side, we've had to tweak a lot of things because it worked just fine in JAWS, but in Apple VoiceOver it was a little quirky, and so there's a lot of that if you're really trying to refine the experience, but to make it as best as it can be for as many people that are trying to use it.
Great. Well, that's an interesting segue into my next question. I've heard of quirks with some of the tools before, a need to supplement with manual testing even when you're using one of these automated tools. But you both have been very positive and borderline rosy about the use of accessibility. Are there any challenges that you experience? Because from my point of view, some of this is really hard. Like, did you experience any, what's the hardest part of incorporating accessibility into your work?
I think, as I kind of talked about, there's some semantic rules of crafting the HTML, or just writing the document, or some of the keyboard interactions, and some of that does add layers of complexity, particularly keyboard management, especially if you're building things that don't actually exist. Like if I'm, or that, well, if you're building things that are your own bespoke version of something that's normally an HTML element, like for example, a select. In our design system that I work on, we have a fancy select that does all kinds of, like, it'll search through a list of stuff and does all kinds of, you have like little icons in it and like a little search icon or whatever. It can do a whole bunch of different stuff that the HTML select element doesn't do. And so the HTML select element is, by design and spec, has a lot of things that the accessibility tools already understand how to interface with. But if you're building it all out of smoke and mirrors, I mean, like divs and spans and things like that, and just CSS to make it look like you're interfacing with something that looks like a select with JavaScript, or if you're whatever your front end framework back end might be on that thing, then you have to go through and figure out how all that accessibility is going to work, that you don't just get for free because it's not a HTML element. So you got to, you're going to have to write a whole bunch of handlers to deal with the keyboard interaction of the device, and make sure that that's on par with what it's supposed to be in terms of how a select actually operates. So you kind of have to go and learn how some of these default HTML elements actually function under the hood a little bit. And then, and then on top of that, and there's some ARIA labels and stuff. Well, not labels, but ARIA attributes is the appropriate terminology that you can put on there. But that's not always a silver bullet. You can't just throw ARIA on everything and make it work, or expect it to behave the way you think it will. Just because you say it's one thing on an ARIA attribute doesn't necessarily mean it's going to function like that when a screen reader hits it. So there's a lot of testing that, an automated tool helps. Having browser extensions, I think Nikki mentioned Wave and things like that. Those can help too as you're prototyping things out. But it's best to do the proper QA with screen readers, or people that are just familiar with working with accessible devices, if not people that use accessibility, for the web all the time. They give you the best feedback, honestly. So user testing, which is always recommended for everything anyway, is just get some users in there and have
in a perfect world.
In a perfect world, yes. But sometimes we just have to rely on some automated tools and some browser plugins. But that's the 80-20. You're already getting really close, and it's better than not doing anything at all. So I'll just say that.
Awesome. Nikki, any challenges stand out to you?
I mean, what you just heard is a big one. I kind of see that it's kind of like not an iceberg, but that's not the right analogy. A mountain, I don't know. You look at it at first, if you hadn't touched it before, I feel like it looks really daunting. At least it was for me. Seeing like, oh wow, there are all these attributes and semantic HTML, and I can't make tables just with divs and flexbox? What is this? um, and it can just be very daunting at first. But once you start doing it, I think it all kind of fits together, in a way that makes sense, is logical. But I think doing it and then being confident in doing it is difficult and is really hard. At least it was for me. But other than that, probably I think stakeholder buy-in is harder than it should be often.
Great answer.
Mhm. Yes.
That is a challenge.
Yeah, especially, like I mentioned, that audit, the infamous audit. It was hard to get people to get on board with that, making these kinds of changes, just because they were so big, and resources were so limited. But even now, say I hop on a project or like consult for a client, everything's already built, some other, some agency or some internal team built all their side of their application, and they just need to look at something or help out with something. And I get in there, I'm like, oh, I can't, like, there's no focus indicator. So I'm trying to pretend to be a power user and use my keyboard, and I don't know what's going on. Or et cetera. I just find all these accessibility things, and then having to kind of figure out what are the things I can fix secretly, like behind the scenes, but what are the things that I need to say, like, hey, these are issues. This is why you need to fix these things, for XYZ reasons, and like getting them to care either. I mean, ideally caring for the users themselves, or if that doesn't work, caring for the bottom line, because, getting more users, getting more money, etc. And everybody, because, the lawsuits and stuff, no one wants
not
that.
Getting sued.
So, yeah.
That's the nuclear option.
Yeah. And then actually another one I just thought of is I mentioned CMSs. If you're developing like for example, like a HubSpot theme, that has a lot of drag and droppable components and modules and stuff, and everything is editable. They can change the colors of whatever they want and the font sizes and stuff. I mean, they could make it completely inaccessible for anybody if they wanted. So like you have to build in guardrails, like deciding, is it worth making this super duper flexible, this little module, or, should I not allow them to make the font size smaller than, whatever it is, like 14 or 16, whatever the case of the module is, so that they don't make it inaccessible. Where in a lot of cases, it's writing up a lot of documentation, either internally, like as they're using it, there's like little notes around, or like handoff training documentation. And that, I mean, is a hurdle, and that, that can be a pain, especially kind of the better you get at doing it, the harder it can be to, get into the mind of someone who doesn't know anything about it and is new to it. So that's probably a big hurdle.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And that's an age-old CMS conflict. With great power comes great responsibility for marketing users. It's a very interesting when considered from the accessibility standpoint. And it just proves, I'll talk a little bit about this at the end, but anyone who implies that there's a single individual in the creation or development or QA process who owns accessibility is probably mistaken. There's a lot of individuals who are responsible, all the way down to the content that is written and produced. So it's pretty fascinating to understand how much of it relies on the culture of the team and how they're kind of educating and promoting upkeep and the health of the site, so that it stays accessible. It's a challenge because it's always changing. Well, just to wrap things up, how do you currently manage accessibility as part of your work? What does your day-to-day look like? Are you doing anything to keep yourself up to date and fresh? Nikki, I'll let you start.
I mean, the day to day, like I mentioned before, once you kind of start just thinking, not even thinking about it, like it's just like in you. Um, it doesn't really. It's hard to say because I think the mindset's really important. Um, but I mean, using those browser testing tools like Wave and the Axe Dev tools, I use those every
Yep.
day. Just because like we talked about, they're automated, so they don't catch everything, but they catch a lot. Um, Especially, and I try to use keyboard navigation as much as possible um, to see what I can catch there.
Yep.
Which, when you get good at keyboard navigation, the entire web becomes so much faster. Just throwing that out there, as long as it's accessible, and that's for
That's a hot
everybody.
take.
It
I
is.
I feel confident in this. Like between just I don't know. I big fan. I use it as much as I can, just because. Unless it doesn't, unless
Now
they're
we all have
inaccessible.
something fun to do
But
this weekend. Wow. Okay. All right.
um,
I'll accept the challenge.
yeah.
Awesome. Nat, what about you? What is your day-to-day look like? How do you keep incorporating accessibility into what you do?
When I'm looking, I'm heads down on design system components almost every day, so I'm almost always looking at something that has something to do with accessibility.
Yep.
Everything that I end up touching, it has a component, and like Nick, a lot of the same things that Nikki said. A lot of times I'm testing something to make sure that it's accessible, or getting feedback from an accessibility consultant that's QA'd some of our stuff, and making that better. I'm with Nikki. I like hotkey tabbing anyway through
Mm-hmm.
through apps, right? So yeah, and you kind of like, oh, you learn some things because you're like, oh, you can make the interface do that with a keyboard. That's kind of cool, so you can find ways that you didn't really know that you don't have to be somebody that needs to use a keyboard to get around a web interface to take advantage of some of this stuff. So
It's amazing.
yeah, I mean, it's just an ongoing process. A lot of times, you know, I hate to say it, but a lot of times it's by necessity. It's like, okay, I'm working on this thing, so I'm going to go learn about this thing today. I might not know much about, like, say, a range slider, right? I'm working on one of those right now, but I'll go look at the WAI site, and what's a range slider supposed to be? Is this what was? And this thing was built before. Well, did we build it right? And actually, I'm going to be sending this one over to accessibility QA because I think it needs to be tested again. So it's just one more piece. It's just like I started off with. You think about responsive design, you think about accessible design, you think about the user interface, you think about how the CSS is going to work. You just got to think about it holistically. It's just it's just modern web development today, in my opinion.
Well, that's amazing. And I know as you guys have come up through your careers and as I've come up through my career, it was certainly not something that was laid in front of me day one. Like, you have to do this. It's something
Yeah.
that's just, we've kind of learned over time. For those out there who are still learning and who are just dipping their toes in, one or two pointers for them. How should they get started? Any pro tips? Matt, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I, I hate to sound a little bit repetitive, but if you're building an interface, go take a look at the accessibility documentation on a site
Yeah.
like the WAS. I
Yep.
mean, really, it doesn't take that long to do, and it'll tell you a whole bunch of stuff about it. And maybe there's nothing you need to do. Maybe you're doing it. Maybe you're already doing it right. The more complex the interface is, the more you'll get into some of that. It just kind of depends on what you're working on. But you know, you just that's how I learned. I mean, Nikki said that he was self-taught. Well, I have a degree in computer science, but I had no idea what I was going to do with it when I was in college into 20 years ago. And I got a job, doing old .NET coding, ASP.NET coding at a web app for web apps for a major audio manufacturing company here in Indianapolis, Indiana. And I didn't know what I was doing. I had to go learn on websites. So like Nikki, I think also said, the developer's best friend, Google. Go out there and search stuff. I mean, heck, these days you can type into Google, it's got AI prompts that give you code snippets and stuff like that. You can say, you can go in there and say, give me accessible JavaScript for a numeric slider. All right, I'll go do that right now, see what I get. So just, you just got to be thirsty for knowledge and go out there and find it.
I love that. Thirsty for knowledge. Nikki, any other tips or points for newbies out there?
Oh yeah. I think the most important thing, and like what it comes down to, like the whole point is like what the user is experiencing and making sure it's actually usable. So I mean, if you want something easy, go like before you even start looking up like accessible carousel, and before you type that into Google, download that like Wave extension or the Axe DevTools, audit the like a page that you work on or like an application that you do, and look at all those errors, and then just click on the first one, and it'll say this is the problem, this is a potential solution for it, and just that alone, you're going to start picking things up real fast. And if you want to go one step further, install a screen reader. If you're on Windows, get JAWS. If you're on Mac, you can just use VoiceOver, or what's the other one? NVDA. That's the other one, right? Yeah. I always forget the acronym, but yeah. Just install it and start using it. And you're going to say, oh, my website is nothing happens, or this is gobbledygook that the screen reader is spitting out. And I mean, instantly, it kind of brings to the forefront what the point is, as opposed to just putting in an ARIA attribute because the W3C site said to. You can actually see what it does and like why to do it. So I think getting started, that's probably the most impactful thing I can think of to do.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you guys so much. I mean, just to summarize some of the key things that I heard, there's a combination of awareness, a combination of knowing the right tools to use, whether that's Wave, WAI, use tools like PokeTech, Site Improve, JAWS, and just being curious about those things. And I think there's a level of, culture and building that sense of both personal and team responsibility for what the output is. And, I'll just briefly share some of the things we do at New Era to help teams build that kind of culture and that kind of process. Our methodology at New Era tries to cover a lot of these things holistically and get at stakeholder and team engagement from a few ways. We can come in and do that brute force that Nikki described, where we can open some eyes with an audit and really go through and understand where are the gaps. Let's talk about it. Let's get an awareness of how these things are impacting the site right now, impacting your users today. We can bake that into a component library and help you implement that. And Matt, thank you again for your perspective on how kind of baking some of this into the fabric of what you build just makes it easier. We recognize as well that this is a shared responsibility among a team in many cases. Some of us are here as individual contributors, others as managers. We have QA specialists, product owners, business analysts who really do need to get to a level of understanding about this. And we work with teams on governance and training models to make sure that everyone is not only aware, but doing frequent check-ins, because the standards change. Different people get their hands in systems and make changes. So it's always good to have a culture of continuously improving on accessibility. So if you want to get started, please reach out to me. You can go to the URL on the screen right now. We'll also post it in the comments. Also, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, please put them in the comments. We are super excited to reply and engage with you guys. Thanks for spending some time with us, and hope to hear from some of you soon. Thank you, Nikki and Matt.
Yes, thank you, Amy.
Yeah, thank
All
you,
right,
Amy.
thanks.